எழுத படிக்க தெரியுமா?
And the third step is arrange catering. Now, it is common to want to list further details of some of these list items. For example, in initial research, there are several things you need to do. So we can introduce another list, in this case, an unordered list like this. It's nested inside the list tags. Now, inside the unordered list tags, just like the regular list, we list items with li tags. So as part of initial research,
Ladies and gentlemen, நீங்க பார்க்கிறது தான் adamantium. ஒரு ஜாப்பனீஸ் சுரங்க பகுதியில் இருந்து திருடப்பட்ட முதல் மற்றும் சுத்திகரிக்கப்பட்ட ஒரே சாம்பிள். ஆனா நாங்க அதை மீட்டு எடுத்து ஒரு பாதுகாப்பான இடத்துல வச்சிருக்கோம். அதுக்காக நாம 2 தைரியசாலிகளுக்கு இந்த இடத்துல நன்றி சொல்லியே ஆகணும். வாக்கின் டோரஸ், அப்புறம் நம்ம கேப்டன் அமெரிக்கா சாம் வில்சன். இந்த கண்டுபிடிப்பை வச்சு அடுத்து நாம என்ன செய்ய போறோமோ அது வச்சுதான் வரலாறு நம்மளை பத்தி தீர்ப்பு எழுதும். இந்த ஒப்பந்தத்தை நிறைவேற்றினா நம்ம ஒன்னா போதுமான அடமாண்டியமை உருவாக்கி உலகம் முழுக்க நியாயமாவும் சரிசமமாவும் நாம பிரிச்சு கொடுக்க முடியும். எந்த நாடும் கைவிடப்படாது. என்ன பண்றீங்க? என்ன நடக்குது? எனக்கு தெரியல. ஆனா நீங்க இப்படி ஓடக்கூடாது. என்னால திரும்பவும் ஜெயிலுக்கு போக முடியாது சாம். ஓடுனா நிலைமை இன்னும் மோசமாதான் ஆகும். ப்ளீஸ் ஐசையா. ஏய் ஜாக்கிரதை. என்னோட சூட்டை ஒண்ணும் பண்ணாதீங்க ப்ளீஸ். என் சூட்டை கிழிச்சிடாதீங்க.
கேப் உங்களை உள்ள விட முடியாது.
Hey,
Sorry, Mr.
Hey,
President.
hey, hey. அவர் இங்க இருக்கட்டும். மத்த எல்லாரும் வெளியில போங்க. ஏஜென்ட் டெய்லர் நீங்களும் தான். உனக்கு ஒண்ணும் ஆகலையே?
இந்த கேள்வி நான் உங்ககிட்ட கேட்கணும் சார்.
என்ன ஒருத்தர் சொல்றது இது முதல் தடவை இல்ல.
நடந்ததை பத்தி என்ன நினைப்பீங்க தெரியும். ஆனா நாங்க இங்க பேசிக்கிட்டு இருக்கோம்.
அவங்க இங்கதான் இருக்கணும். இவங்க ரூத் பேட்ஸ்ராஃப், என்னுடைய செக்யூரிட்டி அட்வைசர்.
சார் கண்டிப்பா ஐசே அந்த மாதிரி பண்ற ஆள் கிடையாது.
அவர்தான் சுட்டார்.
யாரோ ஷூட் பண்ண வச்சிருக்காங்க.
நூத்துக்கணக்கான ஐ விட்னஸ் முன்னாடி ஒரு பிரசிடென்ட்ட கொல்ல முயற்சி பண்ணவர
இது வரைக்கும் என்ன தெரிஞ்சது?
மொத்தம் 5 ஷூட்டர்ஸ். ஐசாயாவும் அதுல ஒருத்தர். எல்லாரும் சீக்ரெட் சர்வீஸ் அண்ட் மிலிட்டரியில இருக்கிறவங்க. இது ஒரு ப்ரீ பிளான் டெரரிஸ்ட் அட்டாக் சார்.
வேற என்ன தெரிஞ்சது?
ஷூட்டிங்க்கு முன்னாடி ப்ளே ஆன சாங் அட்டாக்குக்கான ஒரு சிக்னலா இருக்கணும்.
சார் ஐசே அவர் கண்ட்ரோல்லே இல்லாத மாதிரி தெரியுது. இத பண்ணும்போது அவர் சுயநினைவோட இல்ல.
இப்போ நீ என்னதான் சொல்ல வர?
என்ன இன்வெஸ்டிகேட் பண்ண விடுங்க.
இது நீ பர்சனலா பாக்குற மாதிரி தெரியுது.
சார் உங்க கூட இருக்கிறவங்களே உங்களுக்கு குழி பறிக்கிறாங்க. இப்போவும் இன்னொரு அட்டாக் நடக்கிறதுக்கு வாய்ப்பு இருக்கு.
நம்ம மொத்த இன்டெலிஜென்ஸ் அண்ட் டிஃபென்ஸ் டிபார்ட்மெண்டாலே எதுவும் செய்ய முடியாதப்ப நீ தனியா என்ன செஞ்சிட முடியும்?
என் கண்ணு முன்னாடியே நீங்க ஐசே
இங்க பார், பிராட்லி உனக்கு எந்த அளவுக்கு முக்கியம்னு எனக்கு தெரியும். ஆனா இதை கேட்கறதுக்கு எப்படி இருக்குன்னு பாரு. கேப்டன் அமெரிக்கா, பிரசிடென்ட்.
Things we might need to do include deciding a date and time and setting a budget. So let's now have a look at what we have going from top to bottom. We first have the main parent list with the OL ordered list tags. We can describe this as a parent lists.
ये देखो ये एक वेरीफाइड पीएनएल स्टेटमेंट है मेरा एक स्टूडेंट का.
Oh wow. But this must be an experienced trader.
No. In fact, I will tell you, this guy didn't had any prior experience.
We started by looking at the ordered list, commonly known as
இந்த மாதிரி நெருக்கடியான சூழ்நிலையில நீ இருந்திருக்கவே கூடாது. நீ ஒன்னும் ஸ்டீவ் ராஜர்ஸ் கிடையாது.
In this video, we are going to discuss here.
Hi, I'm Dan, and I'm excited to welcome you to the ultimate HTML represents the parent list, and the second level represents the nested tags. There'll be 2 list items by using comments. All of this content is to do with the features of the Quill app. So let's go and write a Chrome DevTools as part of an unordered list. The same H1. And this is the H1 markup of what we see using file paths, folders from the root directory. So you can imagine for Vista, which is inside the Quill folder, a Facebook page, which is wakeboarding, and given H1 in the body, is having hyperlinks inside list text. Important to note that an ID value can. To really show this effect, where there is a space, you can see this address is a bit more readable, and it appears more like how it would on a letter. Now, a question you may have for your image. I'm going to type img svgs. We'll be looking at comparing bitmap and vector images. And I'm going to open this folder just to double check. Logo.svg, which is inside the images, very long. Instead of having text here, like get started, I'm just putting an image. So the image is acting like the clickable text. Let's go and do this exact same thing at the bottom of the page. I'm simply going to copy this, delete this, and paste in what I copied. It's what we had on the design, just the Quill logo again, and we've made it clickable to take you back to the home page. And here it is. Now, it might look a bit weird why the Quill logo is appearing next to the Get Started as opposed to below. What's going on there? Don't worry about this behavior for now. It is something we will talk about later on in the course. Let's go and sort out our social media icons. Instead of this placeholder text being clickable, we want our SVG clickable. So all I'm going to do is delete the text here and grab an image tag. I'm going to go find the SVG for Instagram. We know that's in the images folder, so I type images / and click instagram.svg. I'll give this an alt text of Instagram logo. Let's refresh the browser. So you can see that the Instagram logo appears, and it's also clickable. And when I click it, I'm taken to the Instagram homepage. Now this one looks even more tricky. We have the image tag, wrapped by anchor tags, which is then wrapped by list tags. This kind of wrapping is quite common, so it is something you will get more used to. But it can seem quite tricky to start. You can kind of think of it like this. Usually in a list, we'd have some text. But in this case, instead of text, we're just putting an image. I'm now going to go do the same thing for each social media icon. Grab an image tag, get the source of the image, and give it an alt text. To avoid boring you, I'm just going to go ahead myself and do them. So you can see now I've added in all the social media SVGs. Opening up the browser, we can see that all the social media SVGs have rendered. Now, because they're in a list structure, we still have this bullet point, and we will take care of that in the CSS course. Now, these SVGs are appearing very large, so what I want to do is just temporarily reduce their size. I'm going to do the same thing I did with the images by adding in a width attribute. Now, a quick alt text of Quill logo. Let's check that renders in the browser. So there it is, we can see the SVG has rendered in the browser. Now, what we want to do is make this SVG clickable. Because this navigation bar is going to be on most pages, and then I can click this. I'm just taken back to the original page, so you can't really see much of an effect. But this image is now clickable. It's a hyperlink. This may seem a bit tricky, but just think about it. Instead of having text here, like get started, I'm just putting an image. So the image is acting like the clickable text. Let's go and do this exact, just the Quill logo again. again, and we've made it clickable to take a bit weird on the course. This play is and click Instagram.svg. I'll give this an alt text of Instagram logo. Of course, you could have written it once and copied and pasted it 4 times, but sometimes this trick can be helpful. And copy this and then just click. And let's width, hit enter. What I'm going to do is type space, width. I'm going to do this in the same list in multiple places at once when typing. Typing the same thing. Let me zoom in a bit. On my Mac, I'm going to click the Option key. And I'm now going to click in the same location my cursor currently is, but on the line below, while holding the Option key. And you'll see that a second cursor appears. I'm going to do the same thing on the other 3. I believe the shortcut on Windows is Control-Alt. Now what I'm going to do is type space, width, hit enter, and let's make the width 20 pixels. I'm going to save this and then just click away. So of course, you could have written it once and copied and pasted it 4 times, but sometimes this trick can be helpful. I'm going to refresh the browser. So you can see that our social media icons are at a more appropriate size. And as I mentioned in the images chapter, we are going to resize this with CSS, so we will later be removing this width attribute here. I just wanted to do it for now so that our document was a bit more workable. Now, the last thing I want to do before we finish up is add an emoji in our H1. In our design, we have a mobile emoji over here. Now, I've left adding the emoji for this chapter because I wanted to show you we can just copy and paste emojis straight from the internet. We don't need to store images separately and reference them, and they're also not complicated SVGs we need to put into our code. So let's go and grab that emoji now. There's a ton of emoji tools out there, but I use this one called React Emojis. They're just a bit more developer friendly. So I'm going to go search mobile. Here are the emojis I want to use. I just click it and it copies it to my clipboard. I'm then just going to paste in the emoji here. Hit save and let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see that our mobile emoji is rendering nicely inside this heading. Another topic done and dusted. It's now time to look at more challenging concepts in the topic HTML forms. This is the bread and butter of web development because almost all web applications need to be able to submit data to a server, which is done through an HTML form. We'll first learn about the different form elements like inputs, text area, and dropdowns, and we'll then take a deep dive into how forms actually submit data to a server. Let's begin by understanding the basic setup and organization of HTML forms, focusing on form structure. We'll be discussing different form elements, form submission, and the form tag. So this topic is getting my more difficult stamp. We're going to be discussing some more complex concepts around web development. So what are forms? Forms collect and submit user-provided data and send it to a web server for processing. An example of a form we all interact with is a registration form. This is the Unsplash registration page. Unsplash is a tool that provides high-quality stock imagery. And over here, you can create a new account. This element is a form. This is the Unsplash homepage where you can search for different images. Although it may not seem like it, a search bar like this is also a form from a web development perspective. The user is submitting data for processing, in this case to find specific results. Now, there are several form elements that make up an HTML form. Forms act as a container for various form elements that allow users to input different types of data. This is a form to contact the sales team at Asana, another project management tool. I'm going to be using this form throughout this topic because it contains all the major types of form elements we'll be learning about. At the top of the form, we have inputs. It uses first name, last name, email address, and phone number. Below this, we have a set of drop-downs. The first one is country, where the user can select from a list of predefined countries. And the second one is company size, which has different ranges of numbers, like 1 to 9 and 10 to 99. The next one down is a text area, where the user can put some text about what they would like to discuss. And finally, we have a button, which submits the form. These elements all live inside a form element. Now, before we start looking at coding our own forms in HTML, we first need to get a good understanding of the concept of form submission. Forms need to know where to and how to send data. We're going to understand this concept by looking at interactions we can have with a librarian at a library. The first interaction we're going to look at is borrowing a book from a library. If you wanted to retrieve a specific book from the library, you would go up to the librarian and ask for a book. The librarian would then head over to the shelf where the book would be and would look for the book. If the book is present, the librarian would take the book from the shelf and give it to you. I want to look at two key things in this interaction. The first is what I am asking the librarian to do. In this example, it's retrieve me a book. This is how I'm interacting with the librarian. The second is the location of the book. In this example, it is a history book I'm asking for. This is the where the librarian is going to fulfill my request. I now want to look at a second interaction we could have with the librarian, which is donating a history book. And it would look like this. I would take the book to the librarian and donate it. The librarian would then work out which type of book it is and put it on the correct shelf. Again, there are still two key things that make up this interaction. The first is what I'm asking the librarian to do. In this example, it's take the book I'm donating. This is the how I'm interacting with the librarian. The second is the location of where the book should go. In this example, it is a history book I'm donating. This is where the librarian is going to fulfill my request. You may be thinking why I've chosen these two specific cases. Like, donating a book is fairly random compared to just returning a book. I've chosen these two very, very specific real-world examples as they closely relate to two different ways we work with HTML forms, which we'll look at now. So let's finally take a look at the form tag. The form element has an opening and closing tag. As we mentioned earlier, these tags act as a container for form elements like inputs, dropdowns, etc., which we will be looking in this topic. For now, I've represented these elements with a comment, which says form elements. Now, the form element has two very important attributes. The first is the action attribute. The action attribute specifies the location on the server where the data will be sent for processing. The location on the server won't mean much to you at this point. All you need to be able to do is conceptually understand what this means, and you already do. It's just the where in the library analogy. Just like in our example before, if the person was borrowing or donating a book, the librarian went to the history shelf. And the same thing's happening here. The location of the server is /API/v1/journals. This is where in our Quill project, our journal entries will be stored. So think of it like a history shelf in the library, or the journal section storage on the database. There could be many other locations on the database for different kinds of data, just like there are different sections of a library. For example, there would be another location where we keep our user data, something like /API/v1/users. Just like there would be another shelf for sciences in a library. Now, I don't love the name action for this attribute. I personally call it something like location. But hey, I didn't invent HTML, so what leg can I stand on? The second attribute is the method attribute. This determines the HTTP method used for handling the form data. We will be looking at HTTP methods in a later topic in the full stack bootcamp, so don't worry about the details right now, let's just get a conceptual understanding. Back to our library analogy, this is the how. In one case, the person was borrowing a book, and in the other case, they were donating a book. In the HTML form, we have different HTTP methods, which detail how we are interacting with the server, if we're there to retrieve, submit, update, or delete data. You can see here that this is a post method. This is like us donating the book. We are sending the data to be stored in the server. Other common HTTP methods are get, put, and delete. The get method would be like borrowing a book. Just like we're asking for a specific book, in web development terms, we are asking to get specific data from the server. Now again, at this point, this all may seem a bit overwhelming, but please don't stress about it. We will be discussing HTTP methods in much greater detail in a later topic in the full stack bootcamp. For now, you just need to conceptually understand the idea of what a method is. It simply details how we're interacting with the server, just like how we interact with the librarian. Let's go back to the visuals of the library and add in the HTML attributes as if it was us interacting with the server to get a clearer idea of how this all works. Let's first look at the case of borrowing the book. The how is the method attribute, and it is how we are handling the data. As we're trying to borrow a book, we are getting it, so the method is get. The where is the action attribute and specifies where on the server the data is. As we're borrowing a history book, we are looking in the history section, so the action would be something like /history. Now I know the action previously had something like /API/v1, whereas this one doesn't. Don't worry too much about that. It's the web development stuff we'll learn about later. The second case was donating a book. The how is still the method attribute, and is again about how we are handling the data. In this case, we are donating the book and not expecting to get anything back. We are posting it, so the value of the method attribute here is post. The where is still the action attribute, and again specifies where on the server the data is. As we are donating a history book, the book is added on the history section, so the value of the action attribute is still /history. Let's go take a look at the form element and its attributes on the /join page. I'm going to right click and go inspect. I'm then going to click on this inspection tool and click one of the form elements here. Scrolling up, I can see the form element over here, and you can see when I click it, it hovers over the entire form. This is the container element I was talking about earlier that wraps around all the different form elements we'll be looking at soon. What I want to do is look at the attributes. You can see the action attribute over here, which has a / with a string of characters. This is the location on the server where the data will be sent once the form is submitted. We can also see the method attribute here. In this case, it's post, which makes sense. We're going to be sending the data to the server to create a new record. That is, create a new user on the database. It's like donating a book. We're just sending the data. We're not expecting anything back. Let's now go check out the form on the homepage. If you remember, this search bar here was also a form. So let's go inspect it. And you can see we have the same form element. The action here is referencing a different location on the server, /s. And the method here is get, not post. In the library analogy, this was like borrowing a book. We're asking the librarian to go get something for us, just like we're asking the server to return specific results for our search query. Now, before we summarize this video, I just wanted to highlight a small thing. Starting your web development career and learning things like DevTools definitely makes you feel a bit like a web warrior. I certainly did. You may go away and start checking out the underlying HTML of different forms across different web pages, and you're quickly going to become confused because you're not going to see the attributes I just spoke about. For example, on this Asana page, if we go inspect and check out the form element, you'll see that the method and action attribute are absent. This is because a front-end framework like React is actually handling the form data. In our Quill project, when we get up to the React section, we'll be doing the exact same thing. This doesn't mean what we just learned is a waste of time. In fact, if you've come away from this video with a solid conceptual understanding of how forms are submitted, you're doing really well. And it's the same concept when we do get up to more advanced things like using React. Long story short, I just wanted to show you, don't be disheartened if you go and check out forms yourself and see some attributes absent. The underlying concepts we've learned in this video still hold true, just the implementation is slightly different when using a front-end framework. So let's summarize this chapter and start to build out the summary card for this topic, forms. We looked at the form tags, which act as a wrapper for different form elements. The form element had two important attributes. The first was the action attribute, which specifies the location on the server where the data will be sent for processing. It's the where, like the history shelf in the library. The second attribute we saw was the method attribute, which determines the HTTP method used for handling the form data. It is the how we interact with the server. Like in the library, we were borrowing a book, and in web development terms, we are getting data. The other example we looked at was donating a book, and in web development terms, posting data. That is, creating a new record on the database, like adding a new book to the shelf. I'll be writing in red on the side here, as we'll be seeing a lot of form elements. This is the form element. Now, I know this was a tricky one. We discussed some more complex concepts involved in interacting with servers, which may seem very confusing, as we have not even spoken about servers or databases yet. For now, if you can walk away from this video, just conceptually understanding the idea that from our forms, we send data to a specific place on a server, like different sections of a library, and we interact with our server in different ways, like borrowing or donating a book, then you're doing great. The details of how all this works we will cover later on. Let's now look at how we're going to use forms in our Quill project. We're going to be using a form on the Quill Create Journal page. This is another section of our web application. It's the form that will be used to create journal entries. As you can see, this form has different elements, like a title, journal type, and entry. But for now, we're just going to be adding in the form container element we have just learned about. So here I am in the index page in our Quill application. Inside the Quill working directory folder, I'm going to right-click and add a new file. I'm going to call this createjournal.html. Straight away, I'm going to grab my boilerplate code by hitting !enter, and I'm going to give it a save. We'll create the title here of Create Journal. Inside the body, I'm just going to add an H1 and add the text Create Journal, so it's clear what this page is for users. I'm then going to add our form element. I do this by just typing form and hitting enter. And you can see we automatically get the action attribute. And if you remember, this is the location on the server the data will be sent. I'm just going to put for now /API/v1/journals. Again, this won't mean much to you right now, but just remember it's the location on the server the data will be sent, just like the history shelf in the library, which is the hit form element. Just a container. There's nothing to actually display on the page. And you can see inside the body, we do have our form element. There's just nothing rendering on the page yet. We're looking at different form elements. There are three main HTML elements that allow you to be looking at in this chapter. The second is text area, where users can enter large chunks of text. And the third is a drop-down, where users can select from a predefined list, like the currency they want to pay for an airline ticket. Forms will often contain a mix of these elements. Looking at the Asana form we looked at earlier, in purple we can see form inputs. First name and last name are text inputs, the company email is an email input, and the phone number is a tel input. We'll talk more about these soon. Just note for now that these are actually different kinds of inputs. In green over here, we have two drop-downs, one for country and one for company size. And here in blue, we have a text area. I chose this first category of input types are textual, 3, so it's nice to teach with. So let's now look at the different input types. The first category of input types are textual. They include things like a regular text input, a password input, an email input, a date input, a tel input, and a number input. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is the actual difference between some of these? Like say the text and email. They both just look like Just note for now that these are actually different kinds of inputs. In green over here, we have two drop-downs, one for country and one for company size. And here in blue, we have a text area. This form uses all three types of form elements, inputs, drop-downs, and text area, but not every form will use them all. I chose this specific form as an example because it has all three, so it's nice to teach with. So let's now look at the different input types. The first category of input types are textual. They include things like a regular text input, a password input, an email input, a date input, a tel input, and a number input. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is the actual difference between some of these? Like say the text and email. They both just look like different text or user inputs. Let's take a look at the Unsplash registration page we saw in the previous chapter. So the first difference is how the text appears. For example, over here is just regular text for a first name, like Daniel. Whereas for a password field, I'm going to enter text, but you can see we get these solid fill circles appearing instead of the plain text. So that's the first difference, appearance. The second difference is something called validation, which we'll discuss later on this topic. For now, to show you how this works, if I just enter regular text in the email field, like Daniel, instead of something like daniel@gmail.com, which it is expecting, if I hit join, you'll see we get this error message saying please include an @ symbol in the email address. So this text input email has some things happening behind the scene to know to expect the @ symbol for an email. This wouldn't happen for first name, it's just a regular text input. Another input type is called binary. There are two examples of a binary input, a checkbox and a radio button. We'll be looking at the checkbox and radio button later on in this topic. Then we have a file input, which allows users to upload a file like a passport photo when applying for a new bank. And then there are a whole bunch of miscellaneous inputs, things like a range, where there is a slider for users to select different values. You might see this on something like a mortgage calculator to select different interest rates. We also have something like a color picker, which allows users to select a specific color and could be used to pick the background color of a web page, like a build-it-yourself drag-and-drop wedding invitation website. Now, text inputs will be the focus of this chapter, and they are the most commonly used input type, and we will be using them throughout our Quill project. As I mentioned before, we'll be looking at binary types a bit later, but we won't be looking at file input and miscellaneous, as they are not as commonly used. And for now, it's better to focus on the important ones. This is also a good time to introduce you to a resource that is the golden standard for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's called MDN Docs. It's kind of like the Encyclopedia Britannica, dedicated to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and is the most trusted resource online. You can see if I hover over reference, we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and a few other things. If you want clarification on the topic, I suggest you search in Google the topic name followed by MDN. For example, I'm going to search HTML form inputs MDN, and this page will give me everything I need to know about the HTML form input. Something useful here is you can see all the different input types, and you can even play around with them like the range input, or entering a password to see what happens. Now, I don't typically use the navigation when I'm looking at MDN Docs. As I said before, I'll pop into Google the topic I'm interested in, and then just write MDN after. So we can see that there are a lot of input types, and I'll pop into Google the topic I'm interested in, and then just write MDN after. So we can see that there are a lot of input types, and forms will often use a mix of them. Back on the Asana page, we can see we have two text inputs here for first name, last name, an email input here, and a tel input here for a phone number. We also have a checkbox over here, which is still an input, but as we saw before, it's a binary type of input, as opposed to a text input like the fields above. And we will be looking at this later in this topic. So let's now take a look at the input tag. The input tag is a self-closing tag and looks like this. The input tag has important attributes. The first is the type attribute, and it specifies the type of input. This attribute is always required, so you have to have it. We've already seen the names of these values, but here are some examples of how it would look written as an attribute. Type equals email, type equals password, and type equals date. And obviously you'd have the others like type equals tel, etc. The next attribute is the name attribute. This assigns an identifier for data collection. This attribute is required when sending data to a server, which is most of the time. So the purpose of the name attribute is to give the data you are inputting a name so that the server knows what this data relates to. For example, if I'm submitting a title for a journal entry, we could call this name equals journal entry. Other examples may include name equals email, or name equals user password, and even name equals name to say the name of a user. You have complete freedom to choose whatever value you want for the name attribute. Now at this point, I want to highlight something that can cause a lot of confusion. when starting out. And that is the fact you can have the same value for type and name. For example, over here I have type equals email and name equals email. Let's look at type equals email first. This is just saying that the input type is an email. We need to enter an email address with the syntax like daniel@gmail.com. But we can also have a name equals email. This attribute is serving a very different purpose. It means that when daniel@gmail.com is submitted to the server will receive the email data as email equals daniel@gmail.com. So the type attribute is specifying what type of input this is. And the name attribute is used to give the data that will be inputted a name when it hits the server, so the server knows what we're talking about. To make things more simple in this section of the course, I'm going to use name values that are always different to the type value, so I don't confuse you. So for example, I wouldn't call this name equals email. I'd call it something like name equals user email. Now, in reality, most developers wouldn't do this. They would just have this as type equals email and name equals email. But I want to keep these different for now to help distinguish these when you're starting out. Don't worry too much if this is still confusing you right now. We're going to look again at the library analogy so you can better visualize what I'm talking about. The final attribute we can have are other attributes. They're simply other attributes we can use, and you can use one or more of them. They're totally optional, so you don't have to use them. The example I have here is placeholder equals enter title. This will simply put the text enter title inside the form input. You can see this placeholder attribute value over here, where we have e.g. John, Smith, name@company.com, etc. More examples of other attributes include max length, which could be used to set a maximum journal title entry. The word required, which ensures the user enters a value in that form field before they submit. We'll look at this one a bit later when we discuss validation. And the word disabled, which prevents users from inputting. This is commonly used once a form has been submitted, and the data is in the process of being sent to the server. You would then use this to disable the form, so users can't change any details during the process of sending the data to the server. Prevents user in that form max tab e.g. John, used to set a maximum journal title entry. The word required, which ensures the user enters a value in that form field before they submit. We'll look at this one a bit later when we discuss validation. And the word disabled, which prevents users from inputting. This is commonly used once a form has been submitted, and the data is in the process of being sent to the server. You would then use this to disable the form, so users can't change any details during the process of sending the data to the server. You'll notice that some other attributes have a value, like max length equals 10, while other attributes have no value, and this is totally fine. Let's go check out the different text form inputs on the Asana form. I'm going to right click and go inspect, and then I'm going to use the inspection tool to click on an input. This input is the type text. It's just a regular text input. You can see it's been given a name of first name, which is used to identify the data sent to the server. And there are also some other attributes like placeholder, e.g. equals John, and max length equals 255, so a name can't be more than 255 characters. Let's check out the company email input. You can see here the type is email, because this is an email input. You can also see the name is email. They've just capitalized the E. So if I entered for this field daniel@gmail.com, the server would receive data that would look like email equals daniel@gmail.com. You can see we have the placeholder attribute, as well as the max length attribute. Let's quickly look at the phone number attribute as well. You can see this is a type of tel, which is used for a telephone. We've got the name attribute, and again, two optional attributes, placeholder and max length. Don't worry about the other attributes inside each input, they're not important for now. So let's head back to our form submission library analogy to visualize how this all works. We've seen that forms need to know where to and how to send data. Just a quick reminder of the library analogy. We want to borrow a book, so we ask the librarian for a book. The librarian looks for the book on the shelf, and if the book is present, takes it and gives it to us. The interaction of borrowing the book is the how. In web development terms, it is the method. And because we are borrowing a book, it is a get method. The location of the book on the shelf is the where. In this case, it's on the history shelf. And in web development terms, it is the action, which is the location on the server. And because this is a history book, the action attribute would be something like action equals /history. Now, we've just spoken about HTML form inputs, so the other variable that we need to add into this analogy is the data part. In the library analogy, this is about what we are asking for. In this case, it is a book. Bringing this back to HTML form inputs, this can be described as type equals book. And we'd also be asking the librarian the name of the book we want. So this would be something like name equals mouse, which is a history book. In web development terms, the type would be an input type like type equals email, and name would be something like name equals user email. The library and a web application are conceptually working the same way. Both the book in the library and data in an HTML form both have a type and name, and both requests are eventually being fulfilled somewhere. In the library, a book is retrieved from a bookshelf, and in web development, data is retrieved from a database. Let's now look at the other case. The case when we donate a book as opposed to borrow it. Let's say we're going to donate the same book we requested in the previous video. So this is type equals book and name equals mouse. So the what hasn't changed. The where also hasn't changed because this book will eventually be added to a history shelf. What has changed is the how, which is now method equals post. We're giving the librarian a book and it is added on the shelf, just like a new record being created in a database. Let's now go back to the borrowing case. So we are back at method equals get. But now I want to change the what. In this case, we'll be asking to borrow a movie instead of a book. So the case, but the point of showing you this is that just like you can ask to borrow a book or movie, so too in web development, you can ask to see different data, like a list that equals post. We are giving the librarian the movie called Unbroken, and the librarian will add it to the shelf like a new record being created in a database. Hopefully this library analogy is able to help you conceptually understand how form attributes of method and action work together with the input attributes of type and name. So a form knows what kind of data it is sending, how it is sending it, and where it is sending it. Later on in this topic, we'll be spending an entire chapter just talking about form submission and going into more detail, so don't worry too much about it right now. So in this chapter, we learned about input tag. We saw that there were several attributes. We saw that there was the type attribute. The value of the type attribute would be something like text, email, password, etc., and defines what type of input this is. Next was the name attribute, which gives the submitted data a name, so when it arrives on the server knows what this data relates to. We can call this whatever we want, like title for a journal title. And the last attribute we saw are other attributes, like placeholder, max length, etc. And these are all totally optional, and you can use one or more of them. All of this makes up the input element. Let's now go and add inputs on the Quill Create Journal page. We will be adding a single text input for the title of the journal. So I'm back in the Create Journal HTML page. I'm going to delete this comment and go grab an input tag by typing input and hitting enter. It is a like I had it. Labels improve accent. The forms are built to allow me to start, and I can start typing labels. They just seem like extra work. I could just use a placeholder attribute with the value of first name instead of using a label. There are 3 good reasons why you should always use labels. The first is that they are generally easier to read. The second is that they are needed for screen readers, so it makes your code more accessible for those who have visual. Well, we're clicking on a label for the journal title attribute to the. I've given this input an ID value of 9 that's somehow connected to this input. And to do that in HTML, for the journal title. Let's now take a look at the label tag. I'm first going to go grab the input from our Quill application for the journal title. As we've seen, the label we're going to add is somehow connected to this input. And to do that in HTML, we first need to add an ID attribute to the input. As a reminder, the ID attribute, which we've looked at already, identifies an element and must be a unique value. I've given this input an ID value of main title, but you can call it whatever you like. It is also common for the ID attribute to be the first attribute, so that's why I've put it at the start. We can now add the label tags, which is made up of an opening tag and closing tag, wrapping the label text, in this case, journal title. To connect connect this label element with the journal title input, we need to add a new attribute called the for attribute. The for attribute is specifically used in HTML form labels, so you're not really going to see it anywhere else. The value of the for attribute has to be the exact same of the value of the ID attribute in the input, so we have to call it main title. So both the for and ID have the same value of main title. Doing this now connects the label to the input. I'd also like to highlight something which can cause confusion when it comes to deciding the values for ID and for attributes. We could have given the ID a value of title, and the for attribute a value of title as well. These values are the same, so our label would still be connected to the input. What I want you to take note of now is that the name attribute also has a value of title. When you get more comfortable with HTML, you'll likely name your attributes like this. And it's totally fine, because the ID and for attribute and name attribute are doing totally different things. The ID attribute of title is just being used to link to the for attribute of title in the label. It's just connecting our input and label. On the other hand, the name attribute with the value of title is used when sending data to the server, so that the server knows that this data we are receiving is the title of a journal. So because they're doing totally different things, you can actually label them the same. And as I mentioned, doing this is actually fairly common, reusing a succinct value like title for the ID and for attribute as well as the name attribute. In fact, there are some circumstances where all your values would be the same. I'm going to demonstrate this by creating an email input. I'm going to grab the input, I'm going to change the type to email, which identifies this input type as an email. And then I'm going to make the name email. Again, this is the identifier that is sent to the server, so that when the user inputs an email like daniel@gmail.com, the server receives email equals daniel@gmail.com. I'm then going to add an ID with the value email, which is used to identify the input element itself. I'm going to call it email. By having the for and ID value the same, this connects the label to the input. So you can see I've used the email value for every single attribute. When starting out, it can be really confusing to know what all these values relate to. So I will be using different values for different attributes, so it is very clear how they relate to one another. So I'm going to remove the ID and for attribute and replace them with what we had before, main title. So in this chapter, we learned about the label element, which was made up of a label opening and closing tag, wrapping the label text. The label text had the for attribute, which was used to connect to the respective input. To make this work, the input needed an ID attribute with the same value. In this case, main title. Doing this connects the label and input elements. Now looking at the form overall, we've added in a label element. Now it is common to have repeating units of labels and inputs. So this is a block as part of the overall form, and we will now be adding more of these blocks as we move through this topic. Let's now go and add labels on our Quill Create Journal page. There are 3 labels we're going to be adding. One for the journal title, one for the journal type, and one for the journal entry. At this stage, we only have a text input type for the journal entry, so let's just go and add a label there in VS Code. So I'm back on our createjournal.html file. The first thing I'm going to go do is add an ID to this input. I'm going to give it the value of main-title. I'm then going to pop above this and get a label tag by typing label and hitting enter. Now the for attribute value needs to be the same as the ID attribute value, so this is main title. And we'll call the label journal title. Let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see that our label now appears next to the input. And if I click journal title, it highlights the input and allows me to start typing straight away. Now you'll notice that this label appears on the left of the input, not above. This behavior we will be discussing towards the end of the HTML section, so don't worry so much about it now. It is normal for this to happen. Now we'll dive into creating larger input fields for user text with the help of text area. We'll be discussing different form elements, what is a text area, and the text area tag. So just a reminder on the different form elements. There are 3 main HTML elements that allow users to enter or select data in a form. We have inputs, which we saw in the previous chapter, and if you remember, there were a lot of these. The second is dropdowns, which we will look at in the next chapter. And then there is a text area, which we will be looking at now. So what is a text area? It is an element used for multi-line text input, used for comments and longer messages. When I say input, I do not mean an HTML input type like text, email, password, etc. The text area is its own special kind of text input that does not belong to the input element. Here's an example of a text area on the Asana form. You can see that users can enter a longer description of what they would like to discuss with the sales team. Let's now take a look at the text area tag. The text area has an opening tag and a closing tag. Let's now take a look at all the attributes. We'll first add an ID attribute, as we're going to need that for a label. I'm going to be building the text area for the journal entry on our Quill application. So I'm going to give this an ID with the value of journal-entry. Next is the name attribute, so that whatever text is entered by the user, when it arrives at the server will know what this text relates to, in this case, an entry. And as another reminder, the ID and name values can be whatever you want, and they can even be the same thing. But for now, I'm keeping these values unique, so it's a bit clearer what they relate to. The last set of attributes are rows and cols. They set the visible dimensions in text characters. The row value is the number of lines the text will fit on, in this case, 5 lines. And col is the number of characters the text will display horizontally, in this case, 30 characters wide. Now, you may be wondering, where is the type attribute we saw in the inputs chapter? We don't have a type attribute here because this is not an input, it is a text area. The type attribute is only used in inputs, like text, email, password, etc., to distinguish between those different types of inputs. The text area is just a text area. There are no other types, and it's defined on the tag itself. I'm then going to add a label of journal entry, and I have to give this a for attribute with the same value as ID, in this case, journal-entry, and this will connect the label and text area. So in this chapter, we learned about the text area tags. The text area tag had an ID, which was used to identify the element so that we can add a label. It had a name value, entry, which is used to identify the data when it eventually hits the server, so the server knows what data this relates to. And it had a rows and cols attribute, which defined the height and width of the text area in text characters. All of this makes up the text area element. We also added a label to this, which we called journal entry. And for the for attribute, the value had to match the value of the ID attribute, journal-entry. So this again was the label element. We now have two distinct blocks of code inside our form. The first block is a label and text area relating to a journal entry, and the second block is a label and input related to the journal title. Both of these are nested inside our form element. Let's now look at adding the text area to the Quill Create Journal page. We're using a text area over here for the journal entry. So let's go and add this in VS Code. So I'm inside the Create Journal HTML file. I'm going to pop down here and grab our text area tags by typing text, and you'll see straight away text area comes up. I'm going to hit enter to grab this. You'll notice that straight away we get all the attributes we need. I'm just going to reorder these slightly, as I like my ID attribute coming first. I'm going to give this text area the ID of journal entry. And as a reminder, this is used to identify the text area element so that we can add a label which connects to it. I'm going to give the name a value of entry. And as a reminder, this is used to identify the data that the user will eventually input into the text area so that when it hits the server knows what the data the user inputted relates to. The cols has a predefined value of 30, which I'm going to leave, and I'm going to change the rows value to 5. I'm then going to add a label by hitting label and enter. We'll call this label journal entry, and the value of the for attribute needs to be the same as the value of the ID attribute. So I'm going to copy journal entry and paste it here. Let's check this out in the browser. You can see we now have our journal entry text area and the connected journal entry label. Now you'll notice that all these elements are appearing one next to each other horizontally, as opposed to vertically like some of the other elements we've seen throughout this section. We'll be discussing why this behavior is occurring later on in the HTML topic. But for now, I'm going to be doing something a bit hacky to clean this up that you would never really do. I'm just going to put a line break tag between these two blocks of code. The line break is the BR tag, which we learned about earlier on in this topic. I'm going to hit refresh in the browser to see what this does. So this now moves the journal entry label and text area below the journal title label and input. Using CSS is the proper way to implement the layout we want. You would never do this in real life. I've just done this for now because we don't know any CSS at this point. And later on when we do cover CSS, I will come and remove this. Now before we finish up, I want to quickly discuss why is the text area not a self-closing tag? The text area is not actually wrapping anything here. The reason is you can put starter text there. So for example, if I put the text my day was, save this and refresh the browser, you'll see that text actually appears inside the text area. This is not to be confused with a placeholder, like we have in the input here, which says enter title. That's grayed out, and as soon as I click into this input, it disappears, and I enter my text. Whereas inside the text area, the text my day was will not be removed when I click into this. It's actual text inside the journal entry. Let's continue by learning how we can provide multiple options to users using dropdowns. We'll be discussing different form elements, what is a dropdown, and the select and option tags. So just a reminder on the different form elements. There are 3 main HTML elements that allow users to enter or select data in a form. We've seen inputs, and if you remember, there were a lot of these. In the previous chapter, we saw text area, and in this chapter, we will discuss the dropdown. So what is a dropdown? A dropdown allows users to choose from predefined options. On the Asana contact page, there are 2 dropdowns over here. One where you can select your country from a list, and another where you can select your company size from a list. So you can see the form here. If I go to country and click it, you'll see a predefined list appears. I have to select an option that's provided here. This is very different to the inputs we looked at earlier, where I, as the user, input the value. So let's take a look at how we code dropdowns in HTML with the select and option tags. In this example, we'll be coding the dropdown for our Quill Create journal form. In the form, we allow users to select a category of the journal, like is this an idea, a reflection, a memory. These tags are going to wrap another set of tags, so we'll move them here for now. Let's go and add the attributes we need to the select opening tag. The first attribute we'll give it is the ID attribute with the value journal category. This then allows us to add a label, which has the same value journal category for the for attribute. As I'm sure you know by now, you have to have the same value for ID and for attributes to connect the label to the form element, in this case, the select tag. We next add the name attribute, and I'm going to give it the value of category. As a reminder, the purpose of the name attribute is that when the data eventually hits the server knows what this data relates to. Next up, we add our different options that appears on the drop-down menu, and this is done with option tags. We have an opening and closing option tag, which wraps the text of the option. In this case, task. We'll add another two options to our journal category. We'll add note, and idea. Now, this is where things are a bit different as the text, just in lowercase. The value attribute sets the data that will be sent to the server. Because the user is not inputting any data, like in a text or email input, we need to provide a specific value, and just the text the option tags wrap is not good enough. We need to explicitly define the data the user selects as an HTML attribute with the value attribute. Now, this can be a bit confusing, so to understand it a bit more, let's compare how dropdowns and inputs work. Taking a look at the dropdown first. When the user selects an option like task, it will be sent to the server like this. Category equals task. Category comes from the name attribute that's inside the select tag. And task is the predefined value we set with the value attribute inside the option tag. Let's compare this to the input form element. Let's say I created a new journal and gave it the title of Serenity. Title also comes from the name attribute that would be set inside the input tag. Now, Serenity is a user-entered value. It's what the user would have actually typed on their keyboard. So in a nutshell, both the dropdown and input have names, like category and title, so that when the data hits the server knows what this data relates to. But the dropdown has a predefined value, explicitly set with the value attribute inside the option tags, whereas the value in, say, a text input is set by the user and is what they would type on their keyboard. Later on in this topic, we're going to look in depth at form submission and how data arrives at the server. So for now, if you can just recognize that on a dropdown, the developer sets the value, and for an input like a text or email, the user is setting the value by what they type, then you're doing great. So in this chapter, we learned about dropdowns. We started with the select tags that had an ID and name attribute. We added a label of journal category and made sure that the value of the for attribute matched the value of the ID attribute, in this case, journal-category. We then added option tags nested inside the select tags. Each option tag wraps some text that the user will see in the drop-down menu. Each option tag also has a value attribute that explicitly sets the value that the user chooses from the drop-down menu. We saw that this value attribute was not needed in other form elements like text or email inputs, because in those form elements, the user is defining the value by typing it in with their keyboard. So in summary, we've added a label element, a select element, and option elements, which are nested inside the select tags. So now looking at the different blocks of our form, we have the drop-down over here, the text area over here, and the text input over here. All of these form elements are nested inside the parent form tags. Let's now go add a drop-down to the Quill Create Journal page. On our Create Journal form, we have a drop-down over here, where the user can select the category of journal they are creating. So let's jump into VS Code and write this up. I'm in our createjournal.html file. I'm going to pop down below this line break tag, and I'm going to grab the select tag by typing select and hitting enter. I'm first going to hit enter to separate these tags, as we're soon going to put options here. I'm then going to swap the order of my ID and name, as that's just my preference. And I'll give this an ID value of journal category. Straight away, I'm going to grab my label element by typing label and hitting enter. We'll enter the text for the label journal category. And to connect our label to our select element, we need to give the for attribute the same value as the ID attribute. So I've just copied and pasted it. I'll give the name attribute a value of category. And just to keep hammering it home, this is used to identify the data when it hits the server. Let's now go and add our different options. Our application will have 8 options. So I'm going to do our nifty trick by typing option times 8 and hitting enter. For each option, I'm going to add the option text. The first option will be an idea, and I'll give it the same value in lowercase. The next one will be note, and I'll give it the same value in lowercase. To avoid boring you, I'm just going to go and complete this. So as you can see, I've added in the extra 6 options: goal, habit, memory, mood, event, and task, each with its respective value in lowercase. Now, the last thing I want to do is just add another line break tag here, so that we view this in the browser. Each form element block will appear below each other. And if you remember from the previous chapter, this is not something you'd ordinarily do. We just can't handle layout yet because we haven't learned CSS, so I will be removing these line break tags later on. Let's check this out in the browser. You can see it defaults to the first option, idea. And when I click the dropdown, I can select the others. Next, we'll learn how to actually submit forms using buttons. We'll be discussing what are buttons, the button tag, and the difference between buttons and hyperlinks. So what are buttons? Buttons trigger actions such as submitting a form. On the Asana form, you can see a submit button over here that once clicked will take all the user entered data to the server for processing. On the Unsplash homepage, this magnifying glass icon is also a button. Once the user enters the text for an image they want to find, they can click this button to tell the server to go and find all the related images. Let's now take a look at the button tag. There is the button opening tag, closing tag, and button text. The button can also have optional attributes. You will sometimes see a type attribute, such as type equals submit. This is actually just the default behavior, which is saying this button is used to submit a form and does not actually have to be included if the button is being used to submit a form, which is almost all cases. However, it is best practice to include this attribute. We've seen the type attribute already when we looked at input tags. We had to specify a type of input, like text, email, or password. This is the same type attribute, but it has specific values for buttons, so you could not put type equals text, email, password here. The other type value you may see is reset, which is used to reset all the user entered data, so it essentially clears it from the form. Let's check out the button on the Asana form in DevTools. I'm going to right-click Inspect. I'm going to grab the Inspector tool and click on the button. You can see we have the button tags, and we have that type equals submit. As I said, you don't actually have to include it, because the default behavior is to submit, but it is best practice, so we do include it. Now, a question you may have at this point is, what is the difference between buttons and hyperlinks? I mean, why didn't we just use the button tags when creating, say, the login or register hyperlinks before, as they also appear as buttons in the final project? Well, hyperlinks and buttons can appear visually the same, but serve different purposes. Let's look at the hyperlink element first. An example of a hyperlink we've made so far is the Get Started hyperlink. Hyperlinks are used to navigate users to a different page. In this case, when the user clicks on Get Started, they are taken to the registration page. Its sole purpose is to navigate users. Hyperlinks will often look like a button element, and we will in fact be styling this in the CSS section to make it look like a button. But don't be mistaken, behind the scenes in HTML, these are hyperlinks, not button elements. Let's now look at the button element. Looking at the example from this video where we created a button for our form called Submit. The button element is used to trigger actions like submit a form. They act within the current page. So for example, once the user submits the form, they could see a pop-up on the same page saying thank you. They're not necessarily taken anywhere new. The button is there just to trigger an action. However, a lot of times, clicking a button can result in navigation to a different page. This is secondary and a byproduct of clicking a button. The main purpose of the button is to say submit form data. Once that is done, there could be extra logic to take users back to say all their journals once they have submitted the most recent one. In a nutshell, hyperlinks are used for page navigation, whereas buttons are used to trigger events happening on a page, and can sometimes also navigate users, which is a secondary effect. Let's take a look at hyperlinks and buttons behind the scenes sometimes also navigate users, which is a secondary effect. Let's take a look at hyperlinks and buttons behind the scenes in HTML on the completed Quill project. Now, all of these buttons are actually hyperlinks behind the scenes. They're just styled as buttons. And again, they're hyperlinks because their main purpose is to navigate users to another page. Let's take a look at this in DevTools. I'm going to inspect and click this login button. Action. The value we can use is reset, which clears the form fields. This is the button with the value is the button. Hyperlinks to look the same. So let's finish off the summary card for this topic. The missing type attribute with the value submit to submit a form. And another blocks in the form. The first area, form tags. Submit the data in the form to the server will be just HTML is to submit. But let's check this out in the browser. Discussing how form submission actually works. Data feature these elements. And you can see by clicking submit, we're trying to submit the data to this form. And it submits. It also submits the form. The button, for example, I'm going to grab our button and just get rid of this. And I'm going to hit submit. And you can see it does absolutely nothing. The button has to be somewhere inside the form in order for it to trigger the form submission. Let's pop it back where it should be. I also submit. You have it there for best practice. The final thing I want to show you is the reset attribute value. If I change this to reset, enter some random data, and hit submit, you'll see that it clears the form. That's the data to a server and response when submitting data. So in this chapter, I'm going to be doing a detailed walkthrough of form submission. As we know by now, forms need to know where to and how to send data. I'm going to recap the library analogy we've been using in the last few chapters, as I just want to make sure we're on the same page in conceptually understanding how forms are submitted. We're going to be looking at the case where you donate a book. The book is given to the librarian, and the librarian then adds the book to the appropriate shelf. Now, there are three important aspects of this interaction we need to look at. So the first aspect is how I'm interacting with the librarian. In this case, I'm donating a book. It's the how I'm interacting. Now, as we've seen before, there are other kinds of interactions you can have, like borrowing a book. The second aspect is where the book is eventually being stored. In this case, it's the history shelf. But of course, depending on the book, it could go to other shelves, say if it was a science fiction book or a children's book. This is the where. The third aspect is about what I'm actually donating. In this case, it's a book. But libraries have other kinds of resources, like old school movies available on DVD. So this is the what. So let's now look at this library interaction through the eyes of HTML forms. We'll first look at the what. And for HTML forms, this is the data. For our library analogy, it could look something like this. Type equals book, which is defining what resource this is, in this case a book, and name equals mouse, which would be the title of the book. For the how, this is the method attribute. It's how we're interacting with the server. In this case, it's post, because the book is being added to the shelf. It's the same as a new record being created on a database. And finally, the where is the action attribute. In this case, it could be action/history. It's the location in the library the book is being stored. And as I mentioned before, because this is a history book, it's going in the history shelf in the library. But if it was another category of book, like science, the action attribute would be something like /science. So this is the form we've been working on where users can submit a new journal entry. So let's now identify the where, how, and what. The action attribute inside the form tag is the where. It's the location on the server the journal entry will be sent to. In this case, it's /API/v1/journals. And just like the library where there's different shelves for different books, on our database, there would be different locations for different kinds of data. So for example, a web application is going to have user data. So user data would be stored in a location like /API/v1/users. Don't worry so much about the /API/v1 for now. It's just web development stuff we're going to talk about later. The second attribute in the form tag, method equals post, is the how. It's how we're interacting with the server and database. In this case, because we're submitting a new journal entry, we're creating a new record on the database, so it's appropriate to use method equals post, just like you donate a book. Now, as I've mentioned in previous chapters, there are other methods like get, put, and delete, and I'm going to be talking about the get method a bit later on. The final aspect is the actual data itself. It's the what. These form elements include a text input, a dropdown, and a text area, and it's where the user will be entering data and selecting data that's packaged up and then sent to the server. I'm now going to step you through exactly what happens when a user inputs data and submits a form. The first element we have in our create journal form is a text input for the journal title. And here is the HTML input element. We gave the input a name attribute with the value title. As a reminder, the name attribute is what is used to identify the data that is being submitted to the server, so the server knows what this data relates to. Let's take out title, as this is going to be sent to the server. Let's say a user types in this input car washing as an idea for a business. This is the value that is sent to the server. So let's also take this out and put it over here. So when the form is submitted, the data is sent like this. Title equals car washing. If the user entered something else like scuba diving, we would have title equals scuba diving. The second element we had in our form was a dropdown, where the user selected the category of the journal. And here was the corresponding HTML. We also gave the dropdown a name attribute inside the select tag with the value of category. And again, this is the identifier that will be sent to the server. So let's take it out and put it over here. Let's say the user selects idea from the dropdown. This is a predefined value that's set with the value attribute inside the option element. So this is the value that will be sent to the server. So let's pop it over here. So when the form is submitted, the data that is sent looks like this. Category equals idea. If the user selected another category like task, then it would be category equals task. The final form element we had was a text area, where users enter their journal entry. The corresponding HTML looked like this. We gave the text area a name value of entry, which again is the identifier that will be sent to the server. So let's take it out and put it over here. Let's say the user enters the text of a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. This is the value that is sent to the server. So let's also take this out and put it over here. So this is what will be sent to the server. Entry equals a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. And if the user entered anything else like a car wash that serves tea while you wait, that would be the value that is sent. So in summary, we have this. For the journal title text input, we have title equals car washing. For the journal category dropdown, we have category equals idea. And for the journal text area, we have entry equals a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. This is the package of data that is sent to the server. Let's look at this visually now. We have our user, our server, like the librarian, and our database, like the bookshelf. The user will fill out the form and sends the data. The data is what we just saw. Title equals car washing, category equals idea, and entry equals a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. This will hit the server, and the server sends the data to the correct part of the database to create a record. This is the method. It's how we're interacting with the server. In this case, method equals post. We're adding new data to the database, just like we added a new book to the shelf when we donated it. The final piece is the action, which is the exact location on the server where the journal data will be saved. In this case, it's /API/v1/journals. It is here the journal is created. So let's go ahead and submit some form data and take a look what's happening behind the scenes. So I'm going to go ahead and submit some data. For the title, I'm going to use car washing. The category submit to be sent to /API. I'm going to go do this again, but I want to look in DevTools at the network tab. We'll be talking about this a lot more in a later topic in the full stack bootcamp. I'm going to hit submit. And as you saw before, the form fails because we have no server. If I click on this first row over here, journals, this now is the HTTP request and response for sending the data we have entered to the server to try create a record in the database. You can see we have the request URL here. This is what we defined in the method attribute in the form. If I head over to payload, you can see we have the name and values, title car washing, category idea, entry a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. So this is the package of data that is sent to the server. You can see now why that name attribute is so important. It's giving a name to the data that the user is entering or selecting. Now, because we don't actually have a server set up, we're getting no response. I now want to go do the same thing, but on our completed project, to show you what this would look like in real life. We'll enter the same data, car washing, the journal type, we'll select idea, and for the entry, a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. I'm now going to open up the DevTools, head over to network, and submit the form. I'm just going to scroll this up slightly. I'm going to click on this first row over here. On the headers, you can see that same request URL, /API/v1/journals. This is the location on the database we're creating that journal record. We can also now see a request method, post, which we defined in the HTML form as method equals post. We're also now getting back a status code, 201 created. This means that the journal has been successfully created as a new record in the database. We'll be talking about status codes a lot more in a later topic in the full stack bootcamp. If I head over to payload, you can see the data that's being sent. We have our title, our entry, and our category. I've just called it type on the final application. We called it category. It doesn't really matter. I'm also automatically sending an emoji for the type of journal, in this case, a light bulb. We'll be adding that functionality later on in the React section. If I now go to response, this is data we are getting back from the server. This is essentially the record that is being created in the database, and I'm sending it back to the front end so that we can then display this journal. I'm getting back a few other things that are specific to the database, like when it was created, a unique ID for this journal, and which user it was created by. Again, this is stuff we'll discuss much later on in the course. For now, I want you to see that we did get a response back. So before we finish up, I do want to look at form submission for the other type of interaction that we've seen in the last few chapters. So instead of donating a book, we're now going to go and borrow a book. In this case, we would ask the librarian for a book, and the librarian looks for the book on the shelf. If the book exists, they would take the book from the shelf and hand it to us. So let's go through the what, how, and where. For the what, it's still a book. And let's say we are asking for the book mouse. So the what here doesn't change. Of course, it could be anything though. We could be looking for a type movie and a name unbroken. For the how, this is no longer a post method. In the donating book case, we were adding a book to the library, creating something that didn't exist there before. In this case, we're just retrieving something already on the library. So the method here is get. Now don't worry so much about HTTP methods. We will be talking about them at great length later in the course. And finally, the where, the location of the book in the library. This is the action attribute /history. And because we're still looking for a history book, the value of the action attribute /history is still the same. But of course, this could be another shelf depending on what we were requesting. If I were wanting to borrow a science book, the librarian would go to the science shelf. So the action here would be /science. I'm going to go and quickly make an HTML form to show you how this looks behind the scenes. Inside VS Code, I'm going to hit new file, click text file, select a language, and search for HTML. I'm going to grab our boilerplate code straight away by hitting !enter. I'm going to save this on our desktop and just call it form.html. Let's give it a title of form. I'm going to be making a quick form where a user will be able to search for different journals based on a title and/or category. I'll first get our form element by typing form and hitting enter. For the action value, this is where we're searching on the database. And because we're searching for journals, it lives in the same location. /API, /v1, /journals. I'm then going to go add our method attribute. And now because we're trying to retrieve values, the correct method is get. Post was used for creating a new record on the database. I'm now going to go get an input element by typing input and hitting enter. This input element is going to be the search area where users will search for a journal title. I'm going to give this a name of search. I'm going to give this input an ID of search bar. And then I'm going to add a label called search. And the for value needs to be the same as the ID value so that the label is connected to the input. I'm also just going to add some placeholder text of search journal. Next up, I'm going to add a dropdown where users can select a category of journal. I'm going to get the select tag by typing select and hitting enter. I'm going to swap the order of the ID. That's just my preference. I'll give this a name value of category and an ID of journal category. I'll grab the label and give it the text journal category and copy the ID value and paste it as the for value to connect the select to the label. I'll then add a few options. I'm just going to add 3 for this example. Idea, task, and memory. And I'm going to give the value attribute those same names, just lowercase. Finally, I'll add a button so we can submit the form. I'll give it the text submit. And for best practice, I'm going to add a type with the value submit. So let's go check this out in the browser and submit this form and see what happens behind the scenes. Let's pretend I have thousands of journal entries, and a few scenes that the request is structured slightly differently as question mark with search equals love and category equals memory. This is called a query string and is positioned after the request URL with a question mark. If we head over to payload, you can see that these are now query string parameters with search as love and category as memory. For the post request, this was not called query string parameters. It was called a request payload. Now there's a lot of terms flying around here. I really don't want you worrying about them. For now, I just want you to understand that get and post requests are structured quite differently. When I was making this video, I was weighing up whether I should even include the get method example. But I thought for the sake of completeness, for the 2 library analogies we've been looking at, it was worth showing you. For now, I wouldn't worry too much about understanding all the details of form submission, like payloads, query strings, etc. It's a complex topic, and we'll be covering it in a lot more detail later on in the full stack bootcamp. For now, if you can conceptually understand the idea that in HTML forms, we are sending name data, the what, to a specific location on the database, the where, and that the how is about how the data is processed, or how we are interacting with the server. It can be a post, where we will create a new record on the database, in the library analogy, donating a book, or it can be a get, where we retrieve relevant data from the database. In the library analogy, borrowing a book. If you can conceptually understand this at this point, you're doing great. Moving forward, we'll cover how to ensure data accuracy and completeness through form validation. We'll be talking about what is validation, client and server-side validation, and built-in versus custom validation. So what is validation? Validation is the process of checking data to ensure it meets expected criteria. On the Unsplash registration form, we have an email input that expects the user to enter a value that is in email format, something like daniel@gmail.com. In the password input, you can see it requires a minimum of 8 characters, so there is an expected password length. So let's see this in action. I'm going to add my first name and my last name, and then I'm just going to enter some random text not in email format in the email field. If I try click join, you'll see we get this message, please include an @ in the email address. So this is validation. The email field is expecting an @ symbol, and the form isn't submitting until I enter the email in the correct format. I'm going to enter it in the correct format now. I'll just do daniel@gmail.com, and for the username, I'll do danbrand200. Now for the password, I'm going to enter a password with less than 8 characters, just 1, 2, 3. If I try click join, you'll see we get another validation message. Please lengthen this text to 8 characters or more. So again, this is validation in action. We're not meeting the expected criteria of what the form wants. Let's now discuss the difference between client and server-side validation. We'll look again at the library analogy. Let's say we want to donate a book. Before we arrive at the library, we'd want to check on our bookshelf, is this the correct book we're taking? We also may want to check, is it in a suitable condition, by checking, are all the pages there? This is client-side validation. It's checks that we do before we interact with the librarian. When the book arrives at the librarian will check for similar things, like, is this the correct book? Are all the pages there? And could also do additional checks that the person donating the book couldn't do, like, is this book already on the shelf, and do we need it? These checks the librarian is conducting are called server-side validation. They are checks done by the librarian before adding the book to the shelf. Once the checks are complete, the librarian will add the book to the shelf. Let's now look at this in terms of web development. We have our user on the front end who sends data in the HTML form. Let's say they're wanting to register a new account and need to enter an email address. Before the data is sent, the form on the front end will check things like, is this a valid email address, which we saw earlier on the Unsplash registration page. This is client-side validation. When the data arrives at the server will also do its own checks. Some are similar, like, is this a valid email, just to double check. But some would be checks only the server could do because it has access to the database. A check like, is this email unique? That is, does the email already exist in our database? Because if it did, we'd have to reject this request. This is all server-side validation. Once the server has done all its checks, it will then create a record in the database of the new user's details. I want to now look in more detail at client-side validation, as there are actually two types. The first type of client-side validation is built-in validation. This is validation that is automatically provided by the browser for certain input types. For example, the email input type will automatically check that the value the user enters is in a correct email format. And again, this is what we saw on the Unsplash registration page, where that message popped up when we didn't enter the email in the correct format. The number type will check that numbers are entered and not letters. There's no extra work we need to do to get these validations. They're built in as part of the input type. The second type of client-side validation is custom validation. This is validation set by a developer using HTML attributes. For example, for our journal title text input on our Quill application, we can add a required attribute that checks that the user does enter a value for the title. That is, the user could not submit the form without giving their journal a title. Some other common validation attributes are min length and max length, which is used to set the minimum and maximum length of characters, and could be used for something like the title of a journal. We might want the journal title to be a minimum length and not go over a maximum length. Other validation attributes include min and max, which are used for numbers. For example, you could use the min attribute for a minimum age to buy alcohol online, or you could use max value to limit the number of nights you can book a hotel room for online. These attributes all have a value that you would set. There are also some validation attributes like required, which we spoke about in. Age to buy alcohol online include min and max, which are used for journal title to be a minimum length and not go over a maximum length. Other validation attributes include min and max, which are used for numbers. For example, you could use the min attribute for a minimum age to buy alcohol online, or you could use max value to limit the number of nights you can book a hotel room for online. These attributes all have a value that you would set. There are also some validation attributes like required, which we spoke about before, that has no value. Now, before we finish up, something I want to show you is that most modern web applications actually have JavaScript handling validation, something we'll be doing later on in the full stack bootcamp. I'm on the Descript sign-in page. Descript is a video editing tool. If I go to the DevTools, right-click Inspect, and I inspect the password field, you'll see that there's no validation here. I specifically want to show you that there's no required attribute. However, when I fill out the form and leave off the password and try submit it, you'll see password can't be blank. You'll also notice that the styling is a bit different. We get a red border, and the text isn't appearing in that pop-up box. It's appearing below in red. This validation is being handled by JavaScript, and it's a more modern and clean implementation. The reason I want to show you this is that you may go around in DevTools checking out different forms and seeing that there is no validation, but validation is happening. So I just wanted to highlight that most modern web applications will be using JavaScript to handle validation, not relying on the HTML built-in validation or custom validation. The most important thing you get from this video is the concept of validation. Let's now go and add some custom validation to the Quill Create Journal page. Let's add a minimum length and require to our title. We'll add a require to the journal category, and we'll also add a minimum length and require to the journal entry. Let's jump into VS Code and write this up. All right, so I'm in our Create Journal HTML file. Inside the input, I'm going to first add the min length attribute, and let's make this 3 characters. I'll then add the required attribute, which ensures users have to enter a value for the journal title. For the journal category, I'm just going to add the required attribute, and then for the text area, I'm going to add a min length again. Let's make this 10 characters, and a required. So let's check this out in the browser. So first up, I'm just going to hit submit with no values entered. And you can see straight away it's telling us to fill in this field. I'm just going to enter one character, A. Let's hit submit and see what happens. It says, please lengthen this text to 3 characters. So we can see that our min length is working. Let's call this journal Fun Day. Now, the journal category actually already defaults to a value, so I can't really test this to show you that it will fail. If I hit submit now, you'll see that the journal entry is now giving us an error, please fill in this field, because we set it as required. I'm going to enter 5 characters, A, B, C, D, E, and hit submit. And you'll see it says, please lengthen this text to 10 characters, because that was the min length we set over here. I'm going to enter more than 10 characters, and because we're meeting all validation criteria, the form will submit. Now, just a small note on this. The particular form elements I have here of a text input, dropdown, and text area don't actually have any built-in validation. If we had, for example, an email input, that does have built-in validation. What we've done is just code up some custom validation. Now, of course, you can have both built-in and custom validation. For example, in an email input, that comes with built-in validation to check the email format is correct, and you could also make that required, which is custom validation. Finally, we'll explore how to let users select options by using checkbox and radio buttons. We'll be discussing checkbox and radio types, and comparing checkbox and radio. So let's take a look again at the different input types that exist.